right, so shalom everyone. My name is André-Philippe Therrien. I'm a third-year student. Next week I'm starting my third year full-time as a student with Torah-Resource Institute. And I have to say that I'm incredibly grateful for all the learning and the skills and the talents and the wisdom that I've acquired from my teachers over these 2 years. And I really appreciated Joshua's presentation, and because I've learned Hebrew and I've been studying through the book of Isaiah and learning the vocabulary of Isaiah, and a lot of the terms were similar with the Psalm of Moshe. And so as a student, for me as well, it was a privilege to be asked to teach. Unfortunately, I did not really follow the theme of the camp, so
we didn't expect you to.
Oh, okay. I'm a nonconformist, I guess, and So I hope to represent my teachers well with this whole discussion. So my title is Truth or Tradition, Pagan Truths, Christian Lies, and the Torah-Observant Follower of Yeshua. By pagan truths, I don't mean that paganism is true or anything, but what I mean is what pagans actually believe and what we can know about what they believed. And Christian lies, well, as we'll see in the in the Hebrew roots movement, there's a lot of misinformation about some pagan history, and you'll understand the title more as we go along. So the first question that I ask is, what is truth? And fortunately for us, someone thought to ask Yeshua this question while he was around, as I'm sure you all know. But unfortunately, this person didn't actually care to hear the answer. So I'm referring, obviously, to when Pilate interrogated Yeshua in private in John chapter 18. So I'm going to read that. Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Yeshua answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him." So here Yeshua tells us that his purpose for the incarnation, one of the most important events in all of history, was to testify to the truth. And we also learn that truth is a category or domain that people belong to, right? So everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And in that statement, Yeshua implies a question to Pilate. He says, he's implying, "Are you of the truth? Are you going to accept my testimony of myself?" And as the text indicates, Pilate didn't actually care to know the answer to his question. He was probably sarcastic or angry or something, so he didn't actually care to know the answer. But fortunately for the reader of the Gospel of John, we already know the answer to this question, and you all know the passage by heart, I'm sure, and I'm referring to John 14, verse 6, where Yeshua says to Philip, I believe in the context, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." So we can infer from this that those who serve the truth serve Yeshua, and that Yeshua and truth cannot be separated. We also see that truth is exclusive. There's only one way to the Father, right? And it's something that's relational in the sense that you can submit to it, you can be aligned with the truth or be out of alignment with it. But even though it's relational, it is not relative. It's absolute, right? Just like we said, it's exclusive. And so to expand on this idea of people accepting and rejecting the truth, I'm going to go backwards in the Gospel of John again, because truth is a big theme in the Gospel of John. So I'm going to chapter 8, verses 54 through 56. And the context here is Yeshua is speaking in the treasury of the temple to the Judean authorities on the 8th day of Sukkot. And so Yeshua says to the Judean authorities, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. And you have not come to know him, but I know him. And if I say that I do not know him, I will be a liar like you, but I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." So here we can see, I mean, some of these things I'm saying are pretty evident, but a lie is what's not in accordance with reality, and truth is what is in accordance with reality. And in this case, it's one of the most it's the eternal and intimate knowledge that the Son has of the Father, one of the most fundamental relationships in all of reality. And I referenced John 17, verse 5, which is where Yeshua prays to the Father, glorify me together with yourself with the glory which I had with you before the world was. And we can learn also from this passage that truth is not necessarily according to the majority, pretty obvious. And so the question I ask is, so Yeshua submits to the truth, but the Judeans don't. And why is that? Well, we're going to find the answer earlier in the same chapter in verses 39 through 47. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, just the words that I've underlined. And so Yeshua says to the Judeans, "But as it is, you are seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham did not do." And again, Yeshua asked them, "Why do you not understand what I am saying? It is because you cannot hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father." And finally, Yeshua says, "If I speak truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God. For this reason, you do not hear them, because you are not of God." So from this, we learn that truth is what originates with God, because he's the author of reality, right? Yeshua says, "A man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God." I mean, and God is perfect in knowledge and eternal. So there's all these different reasons why truth is what is in accordance with how God perceives and authored the world, reality. And truth is something that we must submit to. This is implied when Yeshua asks them, "Why do you not understand what I'm saying?" They should understand. They should agree with what Yeshua is saying here. And so the question I asked in the slide before was, why do the Judeans not submit to the truth? Well, it's because they don't have the relationship with God, with the Father, of sonship. They're not born of God. Rather, they're born of the father of lies. So therefore, they're acting in accordance with their nature by rejecting the truth. So we see here that two categories of people are contrasted: those who are born of God and those who are born of the devil. And it's obvious to us which one of those categories we want to belong to. And I'm not going to go to that text, but you all know Yeshua's discussion with Nicodemus in chapter 3, where this concept of born of God is used is expanded with different imagery. This time it's born from above, or born again. There's a play on words in the Greek there, or born from the Spirit. So all of these these are all different ways of describing the same category of people, which, right, in John 18 was those who are of the truth. And so, indeed, if we receive him, we are born of the Spirit, born from above, in all of these categories, as we learn in John 1, verse 12. But as many received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. So praise God that we're born of God. So the next question that I ask is, how are we as believers, as followers of disciples of Yeshua, to relate to the truth? As I've said before, there's the same category, but different images are used in the Gospel of John. So you're of the truth, or you're born of God, or you're born of the Spirit, or you're born from above. And another one of these categories is presented to us in John chapter 15, which is where Yeshua says that he's the true vine. And so there, the category that we want to belong to is we want to be one of the branches that bears fruit. So it's implied in all of John 15 that we're supposed to bear good fruit, right? That's what a vine is good for. That's all that a vine is good for, really. The wood of a vine you can't do anything else with. And so Paul, in his epistle to the church at Ephesus, tells us that the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth. So truth is one of the fruits that we're supposed to produce. So if we don't produce truth, we're not abiding in the vine. So to sort of conclude this little discussion about truth, we must apply everything that we've learned from John's gospel to our lives. We must desire, seek, and pursue truth. We must submit to it, because in submitting to it, we are submitting and being faithful to God. By upholding truth, we uphold, honor, and give witness to Messiah. And by saying yes to truth, we are saying no to the world and its desires. Because the world is not born of God, but it's born of its father, the devil. And I think in the same gospel, we learn that Satan is called the father of lies. So besides the positive presentation concerning truth that we have in the Gospel of John, the same apostle also gives us a negative, gives us the reverse teaching. He gives us the negative presentation regarding lying. And you all know the passages, I'm sure, from Revelation chapter 21, verses 5 through 8, and 22, verses 14 through 15. So I'm just going to read those. And he who sits on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." And he said, "Write, for these words are faithful and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost. He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." And a similar passage with another list of people who are excluded from the city of God is in the next chapter. So, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter by the gates into the city. Outside are the dogs and the sorcerers and the immoral persons and the murderers and the idolaters and everyone who loves and practices lying." And I think maybe in some Christian circles, lying is not regarded as is not considered as severely as it should be, but in both of these lists, liars are in the same category as the kinds of people that we obviously don't want to be associated with, right? The cowardly, the abominable, and murderers and sorcerers and idolaters. We don't want to be in any of those people, so we shouldn't as well, just as much, not want to be liars. And another thing that's interesting is that in both of these lists, liars are the last category that's presented. And so in the Torah, there's a distinction between intentional sin and unintentional sin, like in Numbers chapter 15 and other places. So I do acknowledge that there's a distinction between deliberate lying and unintentional falsehood. But as we've seen already, this is no excuse for repeating falsehood. Our desire should always be to test everything and to present the truth to people. So the next question, the title of my presentation was Truth or Tradition. So the next question is, what is tradition? And in the apostolic scriptures, the term is used 6 times. And it's positive or negative depending on the context. So you all know Yeshua's words for the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 5. When the Pharisees ask him why his disciples are not following the tradition of the elders by washing their hands before their meal, and Yeshua answers them, "Why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition?" So we see here that when a tradition goes against the word of God or causes transgression of the word of God, it's wrong, right? Because in the context, Yeshua goes on to explain that their tradition made people transgress the 5th commandment to honor their father and their mother. And so in Galatians chapter 1, tradition, where Paul says that he was advancing in Judaism among all of his contemporaries, tradition there could be neutral or negative, depending on how you want to read it. And in Colossians 2:8, tradition is negative as well. So see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. And in 1 Corinthians and 2 Thessalonians, Paul uses the word tradition positively, either referring to the gospel itself or to teachings that are adjunct, that accompany the gospel. So I say tradition at its core simply means a transmission of a custom, story, or message that results in a behavior or belief. So tradition in the Hebrew roots movement. Tradition is often viewed negatively because of Yeshua's harsh words for the Pharisees. For example, a lot of the sacred name movement people will argue that not pronouncing the name of God is a tradition of the Pharisees, and that so they'll say that this is negative, that we're sinning against the word by not pronouncing God's name, for example. And believers who, in Yeshua, who leave the mainline Christian church for this movement often associate tradition with their upbringing and many years spent in more tradition-oriented denominations. And sometimes this results in an uncritical and unthinking Bible-tradition dichotomy. And even worse than that is when people have this dichotomy in their mind between the church and the Hebrew roots movement. People say, like, when I left the church for Torah or something, and the reason I say that's dangerous is because, well, Lutherans and Baptists are still our brothers in Messiah, even though they're wrong about Torah. So, and we shouldn't be making, pronouncements on who's part of the body of God and who isn't, just based on that. And also, by the term Hebrew roots movement, I include ourselves in this, but I just didn't want to use one Torah because I think it's such a nice term that I didn't want to apply it to the teachers that we're going to look at right now. However, the Hebrew roots movement has accepted its own set of traditions unaware. These revolve around the idea that the major Christian holidays of Easter and Christmas, as well as Sunday worship, are pagan in origin and character. And so we're going to investigate these and try to sift out what's true and what's false in these claims. And this kind of teaching is exemplified in 2 videos with similar titles that you can find on YouTube very easily. Michael Rood's Truth and Tradition, which is much shorter. They're 15 minutes each. It's in 2 parts. And Jim Staley's Truth or Tradition, which is 2 hours. And there's plenty of other online ministries that teach this kind of stuff. Like 119 Ministries has a series called Sunburned. And also I'm aware that Jim Staley is no longer. I'm aware that Jim Staley is no longer teaching and that his ministry is dissolved. But even so, his video Truth and Tradition is very popular and it's been reposted like 5 or 6 times on YouTube. So it's never going to make it off the internet anytime soon. So in these videos, man-made tradition is presented as opposite to the true worship of Hashem, and in these videos, tradition equals false worship and idolatry. And I would have done more quotes, but for the sake of time, I limited myself to 1. And this is how Michael Rood begins his video, Truth and Tradition. So I'm not a good impersonator, but here he goes. So traditions. Traditions can blind us from the truth and cause us to wander in the myopic fog of man-made religious systems for an entire lifetime. Many of the traditions of the Western Gentile Christian Church are merely adapted pagan sun god worship rituals inherited from our ancestors. They were forced to compromise with the Roman Emperor Constantine or lose their life for refusing to bow. Most of these traditions were imported directly from Babylon. In fact, there's not a single religion practiced upon the face of the earth today that has not been polluted by Nimrod's rebellion against the one true God. And so the story goes something like this. Different teachers will have different variants and will include different details and omit other details. But basically, Nimrod of Genesis chapter 10, he's a real historical figure, is said to be the king of the entire world before the building of the Tower of Babel. And in this story, he marries Semiramis, and we're going to find out who she is later. And when Nimrod died, he was deified and proclaimed to have been reincarnated as the sun, and thus worshipped as the sun god. So this is where sun worship begins, according to this story. And after Semiramis, his wife, got pregnant after his death, which obviously doesn't make sense. So she told the people that she'd been impregnated by the rays of the sun, which the sun, S-U-N, was her former husband, right, who had now become the sun. And she gave birth to little baby Tammuz. And Tammuz is a Babylonian god who is mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14. And in this Hebrew roots mythology, we're told that Tammuz was born on December 25th and that he lived 40 years. He had a reputation as a hunter, but he was killed by a wild boar at the age of 40. Semiramis eventually died as well and ascended into heaven, but her husband was not ready for her, so he sent her back down to earth in a giant egg, which exploded in the Euphrates River, and when she came out of the egg, she turned a bird into an egg-laying rabbit. Basically, in this teaching, they'll say that the gods of all pagan pantheons can somehow be traced back to this story and its 3 characters. So, for example, from Michael Rood, we learned that the Egyptian sun god Ra was born on December 25th, as well as Zeus, the Greek Zeus, and as well as the Persian Mithras. So these coincidences are very eerie, and we'll look at those. Other teachers affirm that the Canaanite god Baal, the Babylonian god Tammuz, the Greek mystery god Adonis, the Egyptian Osiris, the Moabite Chemosh, and the Ammonite Molech are all different manifestations or names for the same deity, namely Tammuz, or sometimes Nimrod. And on the female side, the Canaanite Ashtoreth, the Babylonian Ishtar, the British Ostra, the Egyptian Isis, the Greco-Roman Aphrodite or Venus, and others are none other than Semiramis under different guises. And also, Semiramis is called the Queen of Heaven by the prophet Jeremiah. So these are all claims that we're going to look at. Right, and one of the claims that's commonly made is that the British goddess Ostra is at the origin of the name for Easter, the Christian celebration of Easter. And other claims include that Easter is in fact the modern manifestation of ancient fertility cults where children were sacrificed. Easter eggs are dyed red because eggs were dipped in the blood of child victims during ancient Babylonian fertility rites. The 40 days of Lent, so the Catholic and some Protestant denominations I think still do this, the 40 days of Lent before Easter find their origin in the 40 days of weeping for Tammuz, right? One day for every year of Tammuz's life. The celebrations of Easter and Passover represent the worship of two different gods. Michael Rood and Jim Staley and others make this claim pretty clearly. I mean, it sounds unbelievable, but they'd really, this is what they say. So they believe that, I don't know, a Lutheran or a Baptist who celebrates Easter on, Resurrection Sunday is worshiping a different god than we are, which is absolute nonsense, but we'll look at that some more. And they also say that Constantine, the first emperor to convert to Christianity, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, and to make it a legal religion, was the primary agent for the entrance of Babylonian sun god practices and symbols into Christianity. At the same time, Constantine outlawed the observance of the Sabbath and the feasts, and it is often implied when people say this that before Constantine arrived on the scene, Christianity as a whole was observing the Sabbath as a day of rest and worship. And this is a claim that the Seventh-day Adventists like to make a lot as well. So we're going to try to look at as many of these claims as possible. So the question I ask is, where do these claims come from? Well, some of them are just I can't figure out where they come from. They're just traditions that circulate in our movement. Some of them are conflations from these teachers' minds where where I can tell that they put two things that were unrelated or from two different sources together in their mind and don't even realize that they maybe shouldn't have done that. And also, some of these claims actually come from modern-day opponents of Christianity who seek to discredit the veracity of the life of Yeshua and of the veracity of the writings of the apostles by claiming that that Yeshua's followers were basically just borrowing pagan narratives of dying and rising gods that already existed before that time. And we won't have the time to go into that argument, but it's bogus, as you might guess. And finally, these claims come from one man. The great majority of these claims come from one man named Alexander Hislop, and so that's who we're going to turn to next. So Alexander Hislop was a minister in the Free Church of Scotland in the 19th century. He was born in 1807 and died in 1865. His most famous and influential work was The Two Babylons, and the alternate title is, or the Papal Worship, in other words, Roman Catholic worship, proved to be the worship of Nimrod and his wife. And it was originally published as a pamphlet in 1853, but it was expanded to a book edition in 1858. And the title of his work, as you might guess, refers to Revelation chapter 17. And Hislop, as many other Protestant interpreters throughout the centuries, interpreted Mystery Babylon in chapter 17 of Revelation as to be Roman Catholicism, right? And one of the reasons for this is because Mystery Babylon is a city, and the city sits on 7 hills, right? And one of the traditional names for the city of Rome is that it sits on 7 hills. Interesting fact, the Vatican does not sit on one of the 7 hills that are considered the 7 hills of Rome. So anyways, just a side note. And so Alexander Hislop sought to demonstrate the pagan origins of Roman Catholic practice, worship, and doctrine by demonstrating parallels between the Roman system and Babylonian mystery religion. He believed that Babylonian mystery religion was established not long after the flood by Cush's son Nimrod, his wife Semiramis, and their son Tammuz, the dispersion at the Tower of Babel, caused this religion to be spread all over the earth, and the separated families of the earth settled separated families of the earth settled far away from Mesopotamia. Because of this, he attempts to link his understanding of the Nimrod, Semiramis, Tammuz triad to every other pagan religion that he can appeal to. If there is a god, he can be linked to Nimrod or Tammuz, and if there is a goddess, she can be linked to Semiramis. Hislop can do it. So Hislop manages to link everything Roman Catholic to the Babylonian mystery religion by applying Christian or Catholic terminology to ancient Babylonian religion. He also creates Babylonian mystery religion out of thin air. It doesn't exist. What he describes only existed in his imagination. The idea, which he implies by the word mystery, that the priests of Babylonian religion hid knowledge from the general population is ridiculous and unsustainable by any investigation into history. One of the classes I took with TorahResource this year was in 2 parts, and it was with Ariel Berkowitz on the nations and religion and culture of the ancient Near East, so all the peoples that were neighbors to Israel in the Tanakh. And so one of the things that I learned was that in Babylon, as in the entire ancient Near East, particular gods had their centers of worship, and the rules for participating in that worship, sacrifice, and ceremonies were whatever the priesthood or tradition of that particular cult decided. So, and most cities would have like a patron god, which would be the most important temple in that city. And so when a city was defeated, for example, it was believed that their god was defeated. And when the capital of an empire, when an empire conquered another city, it was believed that the god of the capital of that empire destroyed the other god. And also, people believed that these gods had effect over their lives. So if you accidentally sinned against some god, against Tammuz or whatever, he could make you sick, he could take away your family, he could kill you. So you didn't want to anger the gods. That was a really bad thing. So it makes absolutely no sense to imply that the rules and meanings and stories associated with each pagan cult and each pagan god would not have been known to the worshippers. Everyone would have wanted to know these things, and it would have been part of their popular culture to know about these different gods. So instead of quoting his work and trying to refute a lot of the claims that he makes in there, because we could be here for 2 days if I were to do that, I'm just going to quote a review from a British newspaper called the Saturday Review, and this was published in March 17, 1859. And it's great. Just listen to this. So we should not have thought it worthwhile to notice Mr. Hislop's lucubrations if his book had not reached a second edition, and thus revealed the melancholy intellectual condition of a portion at least of the British public. For the sake of this class of readers, it may perhaps not be amiss to state gravely why we dissent from his line of argument. In the first place, his whole superstructure is raised upon nothing. Our earliest authority for the history of Semiramis wrote around the commencement of the Christian era, and the historian from whom he drew his information lived from 1500 to 2000 years after the date which Mr. Hislop assigns to the great Assyrian queen. So if any of you were here last year for Rob's presentation on where he talked about chronology, this is one thing that we're going to look a lot in the next few slides. Look at a lot in the next few slides. The most lying legend which the Vatican has ever endorsed stands on better authority than the history which has now made the ground of a charge against the Vatican. Secondly, the whole argument proceeds upon the assumption that all heathenism has a common origin. Accidental resemblances in mythological details are taken as evidence of this, and nothing is allowed for the natural working of the human mind. So, for example, Alexander Hislop will say, okay, so you have a mother goddess and a child god represented in India, and you have the same thing in Egypt, and then you have the same thing with Mary and baby Jesus. And he'd say all of these have the common ancestor, they'll all find their genetic origin in Semiramis and baby Tammuz. But the problem with this is that Alexander Hislop's not listening to Paul in Romans 1, where Paul tells us that man exchanged the glory of God for images made in the image of corruptible man and beasts and four-footed things. So if the sin nature of man is universal, we would have to expect that sinful people all over the world who wanted to worship anything other than God, would come up with similar images and stories and similar things to worship, right? So, and everyone knows that birth and childbirth is something that's marvelous and wonderful and awe-inspiring. So it makes perfect sense that pagans all over the world separately would come up with the same kind of, a worship of a goddess and a child with it. So as this review says, accidental resemblances in mythological details are taken as evidence of similar origin, but in all of this, nothing is allowed for the natural working of the human mind. Thirdly, Mr. Hislop's method of reasoning would make anything of anything. By the aid of obscure passages in third-rate historians, groundless assumptions of identity, and etymological torturing of roots, those who know Hebrew would cry at some of the nonsense he says in this book. All that we know and all that we believe may be converted as if by the touch of Harlequin's wand into something totally different. Fourthly, Mr. Hislop's argument proves too much. He finds not only the corruptions of popery, of Roman Catholicism, but the fundamental articles of the Christian faith in his hypothetical Babylonian system. So, for example, the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Atonement all have their place in, all find their origin in mystery Babylonian religion. If we reject the rest of Romanism because it is Babylonish, why should we retain these? And they conclude, but it is idle to speak seriously of a book which only claims attention by its matchless absurdity and by the fact that it apparently finds readers. We take leave of Mr. Hislop and his work with the remark that we never before quite knew the folly of which ignorant or half-learned bigotry is capable. So I didn't write it. I'm just quoting, and yeah. But you know what? If you read this book, he deserves these strong words. Yeah. So. The next question I ask is, why was Hislop's work such a maze of error and falsehoods? And I didn't write it down here, but the more I think of it, the more I think Hislop might have actually been mentally ill or something, because there's no way you can make some of the logical leaps he does and invent all the stories that he does. If you have a sound mind. But anyways, so to answer the question, why was Hislop's work such a maze of errors and falsehoods? Well, during Hislop's lifetime, ancient cuneiform script in which Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian were written. And so if you don't know, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian are the languages in which the ancient empires of Sumer and of Akkad and of Babylon wrote in. It's the script that they wrote in. And so this was only first decoded in Hislop's lifetime, and archaeology in the ancient Near East was at its inception. For example, during his lifetime, we discovered the ruins of the city of Nineveh, and most of the important discoveries, archaeological discoveries in the ancient Near East, were only made in the 20th century, so long after Hislop's death. And also, it would not be until after Hislop's death that Sumerian, the actual language, would be decoded, because they decoded the script of cuneiform, but it was only until later that they were able to understand Sumerian itself. Because Akkadian is a Semitic language, so knowing Hebrew, it was pretty easy to learn Akkadian, but Sumerian is a totally, it's an island in terms of linguistics. It has no relation to any other language, so that's why it was hard to decode. And also, it was only after Hislop's lifetime that the great libraries of Ebla and Nuzi, where clay tablets of all sorts of documents, receipts, and mythological stories were discovered. And so from these clay tablets, we can learn a lot about the life and belief of ancient Near Eastern peoples who lived around the time of Abraham and around the time of Moses. So Hislop was relying on unreliable sources, such as Greek historians, ancient Greek historians, church fathers and medieval historians, who were just repeating information, and they were not going to the original sources. And, they weren't archaeologists, and they didn't know Akkadian. They weren't looking for the original sources, so they were just copying information from each other. And also the contemporary sources he relied on often spoke from ignorance. And further, the study of religions, anthropology, and archaeology all were just beginning in Hislop's lifetime. So many of the sources he was quoting had little scientific rigor because ideas were being thrown left and right with no one to critically examine them. So thank God that we live in the 21st century where we have 100 years of good scholarship behind us to be able to study all sorts of topics. Yeah. So groups that repeat the misinformation that Alexander Hislop propounded include Jehovah's Witnesses. If you don't know, they don't celebrate Christmas or Easter. They only celebrate the Lord's Supper once a year, and they have a very peculiar Lord's Supper. And a movement called the Black Israelites, and if you're not aware, these people claim that they're the descendants of, that they're the real descendants of ancient Israel, and they have a racist gospel. They don't, some of the groups don't even believe that white people can be saved. And yeah, so anyways, these people make the same kinds of claims about Nimrod and Semiramis and Tammuz. And also some people in evangelical Christianity believe these things. And as I said before, the Torah-Observant movement. So all these groups have in common that they argue that the Christian holidays of Christmas, Easter, and Sunday are pagan in origin and meaning. And so these claims we're going to look at more a little later. And so why is Mr. Hislop's work and theory still relied on today, even if indirectly? Well, the reasons that I could think of are that the amount of errors and fallacies in his book are so many that no competent scholar would want to waste his time correcting these errors. And also, it's a lot simpler and easier to remember and defend the claim that is pagan than to actually deal with the relevant scriptural, historical, and theological issues by thinking critically and interacting with scholarship and original sources. So, it's a lot easier to go to your, Baptist neighbor and tell him that Sunday is pagan than to try to show him through Scripture that you're supposed to be keeping the Sabbath day of rest on Saturday. For example. And also, his arguments serve the purpose of the various groups listed above. So Black Israelites and the Hebrew Roots movement believe that they must keep the Feast of Leviticus 23. So it's to their advantage to prove that Christmas and Easter are pagan Roman additions to the faith of the Bible. I've already went over that. And so also the final reason why I think his work is still relied on today is because he was a Protestant author, and people maybe just assume that because he was a Christian, he was being trustworthy and he was speaking the truth, which he wasn't. So we're going to go do a quick historical investigation of these three characters, of Tammuz, of Nimrod, and of Semiramis, and we're going to look at original sources. So first of all, one thing you should know is that Tammuz was the Semitic name of the god, his original Sumerian name, because Sumerian civilization preceded Akkadian and Babylonian civilization in Mesopotamia. So his original Sumerian name was Dumuzi, and the sources that we're going to look at are Sumerian king lists, ancient cuneiform tablets on which is found the story which scholars call the descent of Inanna, and we're going to look at that quickly. And the other ancient source that we have is Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14, where it mentions Tammuz by name. So the sources that we're going to look at are from, the Sumerian source is from the 1700s BCE, and the Assyrian sources are from 1000 BC and 700 BCE for the descent of Inanna. And so these are clay tablets that scholars have found that recount the story. And so from the Sumerian king list, we know that there are two kings that were called Dumuzi. One of them lived before the flood, and his reign was 36,000 years, so he probably wasn't a real person. And one of them lived after the flood and before Gilgamesh. And both of those kings have a mark indicating divinity before their name. I don't think that means that they became divinities after they died. I think it just means that their name was associated with a divinity. But I mean, that could be argued. And if the second Tammuz, the one who's after the flood, if he was a real person, he would have lived in about 2500 BCE. And so in the story called The Descent of Inanna is the Sumerian name, and Ishtar is the Akkadian name, or Semitic name. It recounts the story of how Tammuz, the deity, was killed. Basically, Inanna had rule over the world of the living, and she wasn't satisfied with that, so she also wanted to gain rule over the world of the dead. And when she went there, she got killed, and when she died, all reproduction ceased among men and animals, so that was a really bad thing. So one of the gods sent help and revived her, but she was still in hell, or in the underworld, I should say. And the only way for her to get out of the underworld is if she found a suitable replacement, or sort of like a redemption for her, a redemption price for her. And so she goes back to the world of the living, looking for someone to send to the underworld in her place, and she finds her husband, her consort, Tammuz, or Dumuzi, wearing fine clothes, indicating that he had not been mourning her death. So, husbands, if you ever think your wife has passed away, please be sad about it. I guess, because when she comes back to life, she'll find you, and she'll send you to the underworld. So this is how Tammuz ended up in the underworld. And after she did this, she regretted this decision and tried to get him to come back, but unfortunately it was impossible. Edwin Yamauchi, who's an evangelical scholar, suggests that none of the texts that we have indicate that Tammuz actually ever came back to life after this, only that he left the underworld for 6 months out of the year as a spirit or a dead person who would have gone to the world of the living to receive incense offerings. And I make a point here that's very important. These sources that I've just alluded to, have been translated from ancient cuneiform tablets from the Sumerian and Akkadian languages and are available for free on the internet in English. There's no excuse to misrepresent what the ancient Babylonians believed about Tammuz. And then we're going to look at the Bible. The Bible, you all know the passage, probably Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14. Hashem is showing all the abominations that the Judeans are doing to the prophet Ezekiel. And so it says that the women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. So presumably the custom of weeping for Tammuz was sort of women associating with Ishtar who regretted sending her husband to the underworld, so they would weep for him. So from the ancient native texts, these original sources, we learn nothing about Tammuz being born on December 25th. They didn't even have the same calendar. We learn nothing about a resurrection, which a lot of atheists will claim. We learn nothing about his death by a wild boar while hunting. We learn nothing about Semiramis or Nimrod being his parents. Presumably his parents were Babylonian gods, which Nimrod and Semiramis were not. We learn nothing about his father being a sun god, and we learn nothing of 40 days of mourning. So, and by the way, the death by wild boar while hunting, where this comes from is from the Greek mystery cult of Adonis, which is 600 BC. So that's 1,000 years later, and I don't know, 2,000 miles away or whatever. So totally unrelated to Tammuz, but these people, Michael Rood and Jim Staley and others, have put these two totally separate mythological stories together to try to explain things about Easter. So it's totally dishonest and irrational. So the next person we'll look at is Semiramis. Our sources for her are Diodorus, who's a 1st century BC Greek historian, who was depending on an older Greek historian called Ctesias of Cnidus, and we know this because he keeps telling us that he's borrowing this information from him. And we also learn about Semiramis from the Assyrian king list. So from Diodorus, we learn that Semiramis ruled the Assyrian Empire as regent after her husband died because his son was not old enough to rule the empire. So she conquered and made war, and her empire stretched from Persia to Libya, according to this Greek historian. And she built most of the great buildings and monuments of the city of Babylon, and she was deified after her death. So this is what these ancient Greek historians are telling us, and this is what Alexander Hislop depends on. But scholars have linked Semiramis to a real person that we know from the Assyrian king lists. And if you don't know, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was from 900 BC to 600 BC. So that's over 1,000 years after she would have existed, according to these Greek historians. And so they scholars link Semiramis to the real figure of Shemuramat, who did reign as regent after the death of her husband because their son was not old enough to rule the empire. So she did reign for 5 years over the Assyrian Empire, but which is over a millennium too late to have known the biblical Nimrod or Ninus, or the Ninus of Diodorus. I'll go get into that the next slide. And so she's also over a millennium too late to have given birth to any human named Tammuz, if indeed there was a human named Tammuz in history. And she reigned at a time when the Neo-Assyrian Empire only ruled a small part of Mesopotamia. So it did not stretch from Persia to Libya. And nothing is mentioned about her being deified, and the city of Babylon was not built by her. It was built long before she came around. So we see that this Greek historian is wrong about most of the things that he says about her. And neither of these sources call her the Queen of Heaven. And teachers like Michael Rood, who say that Semiramis is known as the Queen of Heaven, they simply assume that from the text of Jeremiah. Jeremiah talks about someone called the Queen of Heaven, but we're not actually told who it is. And the Queen of Heaven was probably a Canaanite goddess, not certainly not the human being Semiramis. So the next figure we're going to look at is Nimrod and Ninus. Alexander Hislop is the only person who links these two people together, because Nimrod we only know of his existence from the Bible, and Ninus we only know of his existence from the Greek historian Diodorus. And so from Diodorus we learn that he lived about 2000 BC, and so we've already said this, his empire extended from Persia to Libya. His son was called Ninius, and except for his wife Semiramis, the details of his life cannot be reconciled with any actual Assyrian king that we know from the Assyrian king lists. And nothing about him, except for the fact that he was Assyrian and a king, would link him to the biblical Nimrod, because he's over, so the scholars who study the Greek historian Diodorus say about Diodorus' story of Nimrod and Semiramis that they weren't actually, I'm just going to read the quote. Considering the Assyriaca, which is Diodorus' source, the work of Ctesias, the essence of this work is historical, or it may be attached to the historical reality of the Orient. The details, on the other hand, are invented from the imagination of Ctesias or from a tradition which he is echoing. And he also says, without a doubt, it is appropriate to consider Ninus or Semiramis as the paradigmatic figure of the Assyrian conqueror at the center of a historical legendary telling. So basically, Nimrod and Semiramis, as Diodorus tells us about them, were not real people. They were just like the model Assyrian emperor. And so Diodorus himself acknowledged that other Greek historians disagreed with his source Ctesias on the life of Semiramis, and Berosus, who was an ancient Greek-speaking Babylonian historian, says that Greek historians falsely attribute the building of Babylon to Semiramis, which also means that they could be wrong about a number of other things that they say about her. And our most reliable ancient source, the Bible, and from Assyrian clay tablets, we know nothing of this person called Ninus. So from the Bible, Nimrod is mentioned in Genesis 10, and he's the king of Babel, and he has a small empire. And one way to read the text of verse 12 is that he also, his empire expanded into Assyria, which is just northern Mesopotamia, so he would have been southern Mesopotamia, and he would have expanded northward. And from Micah 5:6, we learn that his name is linked with the land of Assyria. So, from the Bible we learn, right, I already said that he ruled over southern Mesopotamia and perhaps northern Mesopotamia. And we learn nothing about him having a wife or son. We know nothing about his death or subsequent deification from the Bible. We know that he most likely did live before the scattering from the Tower of Babel. So that's one thing that's true in this Hebrew roots mythology. And we know that he would have lived probably around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, over 5 centuries before the Ninus of Diodorus, and over 16 centuries before the Assyrian Shemuramat. So these people lived thousands of years apart, so it's impossible to say that Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz knew each other or were family. Okay, so I'll try to speed through this. So Easter is pagan. The name Easter, according to the 8th century English monk Bede, comes from the month of Easter, which was named after a pagan goddess, a British goddess named Ustra. But Bede is the only witness to this explanation. He's also the only witness to the existence of this goddess. So we don't know of Ustra from any other source other than this 8th century British monk. In the Old English calendar, which Bede provides, the name for 10 of the other 11 months are not the names of deities. They're like names that are related to the seasons. And scholars propose an etymology relating to the word for dawn, or east, that has nothing to do with the pagan goddess. And therefore, attempting to link her to the Canaanite Astarte or to the Babylonian Ishtar is totally irresponsible because she may not have existed at all. And even if she did, you can't prove that there was a link between them. And so if she did exist, we know nothing about her except for her name, and that feasts were held in her honor in the month of April. And this is a point that I want everyone to remember, except for the German language. In every other language, every other European language, the word for Passover, for the Jewish Passover, and the word for the Christian Easter are the same word, and a word that's usually derived from Pascha. So for example, in French, the Jewish Passover is called Pâques, and the Christian Easter is called Pâques, same word. So to say, these people like Michael Rood who say that, oh, Easter comes from Ishtar, there's no relationship at all. So what Easter is in English is the Passover on the wrong date, basically, is all it is, and with many unbiblical accretions. So, for example, the eggs and rabbits have nothing to do with the Bible and are probably pagan, to be linked with pagan symbolism, but they have nothing to do with Canaanite or Babylonian religion because those were too far apart, right? Thousands of years apart and thousands of miles apart. So you can't make those links. The question of Christmas, whether Christmas is pagan, is a more difficult one. The date of the year may or may not be in reaction to pagan celebrations. From all that I've read, this is what I would conclude. And there's a number of different scholarly theories relating to the origin of the date of Christmas, of December 25th. And I don't think any of them are conclusive, and some of them don't actually rule out the other explanations. The most popular theory for the origin of December 25th as the date for Christmas is that it was decided by the Church in Rome to be a day of celebrating the birth of Yeshua as in reaction to feasts that were held in honor of the unconquered son Mithras. But there's a number of problems in that theory, which we can get to if people want to ask at the end. Nevertheless, other pagan celebrations did occur around this time of year, such as the Roman festival of Saturnalia, which would have been from December 13th to December 21, and Brumalia. So Christmas could have been the date of Christmas could have been a reaction to these Roman feasts being held at this time. Obviously, the gospel writers did not care about us knowing the birth date of Yeshua, and the early church did not celebrate it for certain until the 4th century. So the earliest time that we can say for sure that Christians were celebrating the birth of Yeshua was in 336 of the Common Era, so long after the time of Yeshua. And the earliest source that we can that mentions celebrations in the honor of the Roman god Sol, which is the god of the sun, and the celebration of the birth of Yeshua on the same date. The earliest source that we have for that is a calendar of the year 354. So it is possible that celebrations in the honor of the pagan god Sol were in reaction to the Christian date for Christmas, but I wouldn't make any canonical proclamations on that either, because the opposite is possible as well. Most practices that are associated with the celebration of Christmas today, so like Christmas tree, Yule log, and these things are pagan in origin, and most of those symbols cannot satisfactorily be associated with any biblical meaning. So in a certain sense, yes, Christmas is pagan. So the next question is, Sunday worship is pagan. We're going to look quickly at quotes from the Church Fathers, and after that my presentation will be done. So the first quote is from the Epistle of Barnabas, which was not written by the biblical Barnabas. It was attributed to him, but scholars agree that it would have been written in the early 2nd century. So this is very early. This is maybe 30 years after the death of the Apostle John. And so Barnabas writes in his epistle, I can't remember to which church, but he writes, finally, God says to them, your new moons and your Sabbaths I cannot away with. And this is a quote from Isaiah chapter 1. You see what is his meaning? It is not your present Sabbaths that are acceptable unto me, but the Sabbath which I have made, in the which when I have set all things at rest, I will make the beginning of the 8th day, so Sunday, which is the beginning of another world. Wherefore also we keep the 8th day for rejoicing, in the which also Yeshua rose from the dead, and having been manifested, ascended into the heavens. And if you read the Epistle of Barnabas, you'll see that it's very anti-Torah in its stance, and it allegorizes the Tanakh. So, for example, Barnabas explains the laws against eating swine as meaning that we shouldn't associate with people who are of the spirit of swine. So that's an interesting interpretation. Another church father that we're going to look at quickly is Ignatius. He wrote an epistle to the church at Magnesia around the year 107, when he would have been traveling to Rome for his martyrdom. And so in this epistle, I'm skipping a few verses in between, but chapters 8, 9, and 10 of this epistle is what we're going to read. He says, "Do not be led astray by those erroneous teachings and ancient fables which are utterly worthless. Indeed, if at this date we still conform to Judaism, then we own that we have not received grace. Consequently, if the people who were given to obsolete practices, referring to the Jews, face the hope of a new life, and if these no longer observe the Sabbath, but regulate their calendar by the Lord's day," by which he means Sunday, "the day too on which our life," meaning Yeshua, "arose by his power, and through the medium of his death, though some deny this, and if to this mystery we owe our faith, and because of it submit to sufferings to prove ourselves disciples of Yeshua, Messiah, our only teacher." And in chapter 10 he says, "It is absurd to have Jesus Christ on the lips and at the same time to live like a Jew. No, Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism believed in Christianity, and in its bosom was assembled everyone professing faith in God." So you can see that he's also very anti-Torah, and remember this, if the scholarly guesses are right, which they're guessing the lifetime of Ignatius from the church historian Eusebius, who lived in the 4th century, but there's not really any reason not to believe that Eusebius was accurate on this. So if the date is right, then in the year 107, we have a church father writing and arguing anti-Torah positions and arguing that Sunday replaced the Sabbath. Okay. And another quote, the last quote that I'm going to read from the Church Fathers, is Justin Martyr. And if you don't know, his dialogue with Trypho is a very interesting read. It's an imaginary dialogue between Justin Martyr and a Jew called Trypho, where Justin Martyr is explaining why Christianity is right and Judaism is wrong. But if some, through weak-mindedness, wish to observe such institutions as were given by Moses, from which they expect some virtue, but which we believe were appointed by reason of the hardness of the people's hearts, along with their hope in this Christ, and wish to perform the eternal and natural acts of righteousness and piety, yet choose to live with the Christians and the faithful, as I said before, not inducing them either to be circumcised like themselves, or to keep the Sabbath, or to observe any other such ceremonies, then I hold that we ought to join ourselves to such, and associate with them in all things as kinsmen and brethren. So Justin is saying, if there's Jews who want to observe the Sabbath and be part of the community of Messiah, that's fine, as long as they're not forcing other people to. But if Trypho, I continued, some of your race who say they believe in this Christ compel those Gentiles who believe in this Christ to live in all respects according to the law given by Moses, or choose not to associate so intimately with them, I in like manner do not approve of them. So he's saying it's wrong for Jewish believers in Messiah to tell Christians to observe the Sabbath or eat kosher or these things. And so Justin Martyr is the first major example of defending Christian doctrines by someone with training in Greek philosophy. So the answer to the question, Sunday worship, is it pagan? No, it is not. The change of the day of worship happened 2 centuries before the Council of Nicaea and Constantine's edict. It was adopted generally, though not by everyone. We know that there were many Sabbath keepers pretty late, but the majority of the church adopted Sunday worship very early on, and it was adopted during periods of persecution. So from that, it's very difficult to argue that Christians borrowed Sunday because they were borrowing from pagans who were worshiping the sun on Sunday. So I don't know if you've heard that argument made before, that, oh, Sunday is the day of the worship of the sun. Well, that's nonsense historically, because Christians made the decision to worship on Sunday in periods of intense persecution. And so it was as a result of early rejection of Torah. And this rejection of Torah in the church was due to a number of factors. The most obvious one is misunderstanding Paul, right? As we know from the Apostle Peter, just as just as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given him, wrote to you, as also in all his letters, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to understand, which the untaught and unstable distort, as they also do the rest of the scriptures to their own destruction. So we know from inspired scripture that Paul is difficult to understand, and this is what happened in the early church. Another reason why the church rejected the Torah very early is because of the two Jewish revolts, right? I don't think it's from the book of Romans or from Peter's first epistle. It's very hard to argue that God wants us to rebel against government authorities. So I believe the Christians would not have rebelled alongside with the Jews in Judea in the first Jewish revolt. And as you know, in the second Jewish revolt was centered around the messianic figure of Bar Kokhba. So if a Christian wanted to help the Judeans fight off Rome, they would have had to have sworn allegiance to Bar Kokhba as the Messiah, which you can't do without denying Yeshua. So another reason why the church rejected Torah very early on is because the Gentiles outpopulated the dwindling Jews in most areas. So in most areas, Gentiles multiplied in the church while the Jewish population did not. And also, the Jewish persecution of believers is another reason why Torah was rejected very early. So, Sunday worship is not at all pagan, but is it biblical? Of course not, right? We all know this. It's the only way that you could argue it from it that you could argue for it biblically is if you distort the scriptures. So, our conclusions. The Nimrod, Semiramis, Tammuz triad and all associated stories are hogwash. For the most part, they originate with the farcical ramblings of one man, Alexander Hislop, whose work, The Two Babylons, is utter baloney. And hogwash and baloney are not kosher. Sunday worship is not pagan in origin or in meaning. Rather, it depends on a sincere misunderstanding of the Bible and on very powerful historical factors. The date of Christmas is possibly a reaction to pagan holidays, and if it is, I would argue that it's not a borrowing from pagan holidays, because they would have been, they would have chosen the date of Christmas so that the faithful would not be participating in pagan events on that day. So even though it might have been wrong-headed, they were reacting to a pagan date, not borrowing from pagan worship. And the symbolism associated with the celebration of Christmas are pagan in origin and can hardly be attributed any biblical significance. Another conclusion, the date of Easter is the result of the church leaving the Jewish calendar and the Jewish reckoning of the Passover for an astronomically regulated celebration of Yeshua's crucifixion and resurrection. So it has nothing to do with worshiping two different gods, as Michael Rood would have us believe. Rather, originally in the early church, Easter was celebrated 2 days after the Jews celebrated Passover, so they would have celebrated Yeshua's resurrection on the 16th of Nisan. But the problem with this, obviously, is that then the church is dependent upon the synagogue for the date of its most important holiday. So that's why early on, and that's why the Constantine and the Council of Nicaea decreed that the entire church should be observing the date of Easter rather by celebrating it always on a Sunday, and it would be the Sunday that's on or after the full moon following the vernal equinox.
Unless that falls on Passover.
Unless it falls on Passover. So, and obviously the 16th of Nisan does not always fall on a Sunday either. So the date of Easter is it's the wrong date, but it is Passover, just with a whole bunch of pagan accretions, as we've said before, or unbiblical accretions like eggs and rabbits. The name of Easter in English and German is most unlikely to be linked with a British goddess. In every other language, the word for the Christian Easter is usually exactly the same word as the word for the Jewish Passover. And so, just to finish, the Hebrew roots movement must forsake false and half-true arguments because they are a false witness to people, because we're using unjust weights and measures, and both of these are things that we're not supposed to do according to Torah, and because when we do that, we're wanting the truth to serve our needs rather than us serving the truth by diligently searching it out. So we're acting like the Judean authorities who want to make Yeshua out as what they wanted him to be, rather than actually listening to him and acknowledging and acting according to the truth. And the Hebrew Roots movement should forsake these arguments because we're associating ourselves with the wrong people. We're associating with, Jehovah's Witnesses who don't believe in the deity of Yeshua, and we're associating with black Israelites who have a racist gospel. And also we're making ourselves fools to evangelical Christianity, and by that I mean especially apologists and seminarians and well-read laymen. And another reason why the Hebrew Roots movement must forsake these false or half-true arguments is because we bring believers to the Torah on false pretenses. Now, I'm not saying that God can't use means, right? We all know that from the story of Joseph. And for example, myself, I came to the Torah movement because I believe a number of untruths, but now I stay in the Torah movement because I believe the Bible teaches Christians should observe the Torah. So we don't want to bring believers to the Torah movement on false pretenses. For many reasons. So what should we do now? We should stop repeating lies and start exercising responsible discipleship by diligently searching out the truth. We should stick to the Bible to argue Torah observance. We should also explain the early church's departure from Torah by appealing to the Jewish revolts and the other historical factors that I talked about. Uncertainty and nuance are not sins when the evidence of scholarship is ambiguous. So I tried to demonstrate that today because a number of places I would have liked to have made, definitive proclamations, like say on the origin of the date of Christmas, or on whether or not Easter actually comes from the pagan god Ostra. But I tried to be nuanced and say, we're not 100% sure about this or that. And so uncertainty and nuance are not sins, and in fact they're what we should be doing when we can't be certain about the evidence. And so we should do all of these things in order to worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Michael Rood and Jim Staley and all these other teachers who repeat this mythology, this Hebrew roots mythology, always start their presentation by appealing to this verse from John chapter 4, where Yeshua tells us that we're supposed to worship the Father in spirit and truth. And I find it ironic and frustrating that they're not using the truth when they do that. So let's do it truly. And so may we be diligent in serving the truth in Yeshua's name. Well, no, I think it's very important. Ralph Woodrow is an evangelical. He leads an evangelical ministry, and he's been working long before the internet. So most of his things are tracts and small booklets. And so in 1966, he published a book called Babylon Mystery Religion, or something like that, where he just repeats all of Alexander Hislop's claims. And this book was translated in 25 different languages, and he sold over 300,000 copies. And he sort of became an authority in this area, and he was invited to speak in evangelical churches all over the United States and the world on these topics. And eventually, one school teacher questioned him on these things and told him that Alexander Hislop's work is very unscholarly and full of falsehood. And so he looked into it, and what he did, well, he removed his original book from printing and then printed a book called, I can't remember the title now, but if you go on Ralph's, huh?
It's called I'm So Sorry.
But if you go on his website, you'll find the title of that book. And I just think it's a great example because I think
That's what I was going to bring up.
I think it's a great example because he recognized his error and actually lost money to remove his original book from circulation and to publish a new book correcting all of his errors. So I think he's a good example for what the Hebrew Roots movement should do regarding these claims. Well, if people want to learn to read a work that simply refutes Alexander Hislop in a way that's really easy to understand, I'd recommend Ralph Woodrow's work. It's very easy to read. I was reading it on breaks at work, and it's very easy to read. That's a good book to read. Otherwise, I mean, don't make claims where you haven't done your homework, I guess. And doing our homework is hard work. And I think people today are just not willing to do the hard work of research. I myself have not been able to read through all the sources that I wanted to read and answer all the questions that I wanted to answer when I was preparing for this. So yeah, the truth is hard work. And today we live in a fast food consumer world, consumer culture, where we want everything now. And so, but we can't. The truth is not something that you can have that easily. Especially in terms of history, it requires investigation and logical reasoning and hard thinking. Okay. Eusebius, he's considered sort of the first church historian. He was at the Council of Nicaea and recorded most of those events.
Who's that?
Eusebius. Eusebius. And unfortunately, I didn't get to reading that because I wanted to be more specific about what Constantine said about the day of rest. But anyways, if you wanted to learn more about that, it'd be from Eusebius. It's chronologically, I would dispute their claim because I don't believe you can speak of the Roman Catholic Church before the 5th or 6th or 7th centuries. Like in the days of the Council of Nicaea, there wasn't even a single bishop at Rome. There were more than, I think so. I think there were more than one bishop at Rome.
These core divisions of the church at that time.
Yeah, so they argue that the Council of Nicaea was a Catholic thing, which it isn't. So I think part of the reason that it happened is because of Paul's emphasis on the need that we don't have to change our ethnic identity to be in Messiah, right? So Gentiles can be in Messiah. They don't need to be circumcised or go through any ceremony or to listen to any of these Judaizers, right, as Paul uses the word in Galatians. So because of that, the Gentiles maybe would have been thinking once there was persecution on the Jews and taxing the Jews, they would have been thinking, well, I don't have to be Jewish to be in Messiah, so, why do I have to keep the Sabbath, which is this very Jewish symbol?